All right, let us proceed. Um, Today, this is based on our experiences, I think, as both providers and consumers of support. And it's how to be a better consumer of technical support. So we'll touch on just 3 or so major topics, but I think most of you on the call know us and our various points of view, our smiling, happy faces there, a handsome group of people. But relatives to support, like we want to talk about, this is like travel, right? Before you fly, while you're in the air, et cetera. So before you engage, some resources and ideas for how to get support, and then some best practices when you're engaging support, when you're in the middle of it. We'll drill right in and start in. I think everybody's got some experience in this regard. So before you engage, Todd, I think maybe you could start off because you brought some of this up in our prep session.
Yeah, this was one that's passionate to me, and because and I guess everybody on the call, people come to me asking for help all the time. I mean, it happens in email all the time, Twitter, whatever. And so for me, when I pitched this idea several weeks ago, it was more about troubleshooting steps, and then the group kind of refined it into that. But so some of the things to do before you engage support, and one of the things that I want to mention, and we'll hit it more down the road, is be respectful of the people whose help you're asking for, and you can do that by trying a bunch of stuff on your own. And so one of those things is just standard troubleshooting techniques, so my dad worked for Motorola my entire life. My dad, if it had an on-off switch, my dad bought one of them and then just fixed it for the rest of his life. And so I got to watch that process play out for 40 years. And so I just kind of take for granted knowing how to troubleshoot things, but that's not apparently ingrained. I learned that. So anytime you've got a problem, try to break that problem down. So one of the jokes that we talked about when we were prepping for this is we get these emails: SharePoint doesn't work, or PowerShell doesn't work. Well, yeah, I mean, at a high level, that's absolutely correct. But what doesn't work? Look at the problem, break it down. Does the page not load? Okay. And then if you've got a page that doesn't load, do all the pages not load, or is it just these pages? And if it's these pages, is the pages in just this site? Like, take the problem and break it down into chunks and figure out where the problem's at, and then start swapping pieces out and see what follows the problem. So that's one of the things. Like we were talking about a customer who had a page that was loading slowly, and they've got some web parts on it. So one of the obvious things to try is put that same web part on another page. Does that page load slowly? If so, maybe the web part. If not, something in that site. So it's things like that. Just kind of break it apart. And one of the things that go ahead,
Todd. I was going to say along that similar vein, especially when you have a page, something like a page is low or it's not working, is to take all the web parts off the page and try to isolate the problem and load one and check and see if it works. Load a second one and see what works. Because I think that's really, very basic and like trying to figure out, narrow it down. So is it the news web part, or is it this custom web part, or is it this, or is it that?
Yeah. And I don't remember if it still works in Office 365, but the way that I would always do that with on-prem SharePoint is to go to any page, like Home ASPX or whatever, and put $contents = 1. And that would take you on-prem, that would take you to the web part maintenance page, and it would show you all the web parts on that page, whether they were hidden or not, and you could see everything. So you could do what Derek had talked about, start pulling them off and all that. That would happen a lot on-prem because people would go in and hide web parts, and then they wouldn't know they were in the background. So talking about that, breaking things up and adding web parts and all that, something I think we're probably going to talk about later in the call, but have a dev tenant. Don't be afraid to try things. Get a dev tenant and just be ready to go in there and try things and make peace with the fact that you're just going to get your hands dirty and you're going to break stuff. One of the things that we talked about when we were prepping for this is we've all gotten emails or tweets or calls from somebody that would say, what happens if I do this? What happens if I add a person to this group? And we've all had these questions, and our first thought is, well, did you just try it? Did you just add the person to the group? Did you just see if you could add this group to another group? And I get being afraid of mucking up production. I think on this, of the Sympraxians, I'm the most timid of us all. But having a dev tenant gives you the ability to do all that. Try all of the things, all of your stupid ideas, because you're not going to break anything. And so that's my biggest piece of advice: get that dev tenant and get your hands dirty. Another one that and I guess so that one is, being okay with failing, and a subsection of that is be okay with failing fast. So Julie and I were troubleshooting a thing yesterday. Had a migration that was failing in ShareGate. This document library has 4,000 files in it, and a bunch of things were failing. And as we were talking out the thing, I was pretty sure this next thing I tried was going to be the fix, and then the thing after that, and the thing after that. And Julie reminded me, don't try with the whole document library. Just pick one document and try that. Now, obviously after I make the change, I'm going to try it to see if it failed or not. But more importantly than that, fail quickly. So pick one document, migrate it over. Don't wait for the whole 3,000. So that's another good piece of advice. And probably the last thing that I want to bring up is this fun thing that I've become exposed to recently called rubber duck debugging. And this is the idea that rubber ducks can solve all of your problems, and that you should have a rubber duck on your desk. And whenever you're stuck and something doesn't work, pick up the rubber duck and explain your problem to the rubber duck, and the rubber duck will help you solve it.
Or just call Julie.
No,
Apparently she can be your rubber duck.
Yep. Julie's my rubber duck sometimes. But it's that idea that we all know that you can explain the problem when you start explaining the problem to somebody else, whether they actually have the technical skills to help you solve it or not. Just explaining it to them often unlocks things. And so that's the rubber duck is a proxy for that. But it's just kind of a fun one. So don't be afraid to talk to somebody else and just bounce an idea off of them. Have somebody you can do that with, a trusted place, and just talk the problem out. And that helps a lot.
And if the duck just gives you this glazed stare, that means you're not explaining it well enough.
Yeah, so there's a great, and I'll link it in the chat room. There's a great page on the rubber duck programming that talks about, if rubber ducks are so smart, why don't they just solve all your problems? And it's because ducks like to mentor you and things. I mean, it's just this great. I love it. So I love the rubber duck programming.
So notwithstanding rubber ducks, we did talk about a good problem statement and repro steps are gold, right?
Yeah.
On this browser, on this device, I was on VPN, I wasn't on VPN. These were the inputs, these were the outputs. Like, we could probably construct that into a template that would be really outstanding for that. Just a really good problem statement is the minimum you should have before going to support, along with the fact that, hey, you already Googled this. Like, I've learned from interacting with Julie on technical questions that I should not engage a developer unless A, I have something I can reproduce, and B, I Googled it and found that I don't know the answer from a simple Google. Like, that is when engaging smart technical people, those are two pretty important prereqs.
Is that really how we engage each other?
There are times when you just don't know what piece of the thing that you're doing is the broken piece, right? So you may not know what the repro steps are, or what whether you're a VPN and all that sort of stuff. But whatever it is you do know, you should provide that, or at least list that stuff out, and admit that you don't know. Say, I'm not sure where the problem is and I can't reproduce this, but here's what I'm seeing, right? Because if you say every time I do X, this happens, and that's not actually the case, that's not helpful. If you don't know if it happens every time, you should actually understand that that's important.
Yeah.
Another piece of gold, if you're taking screenshots, include your entire screen, so that you can see the URL, the browser, and the error message, not just the isolated error message, because that's not going to be helpful out of context.
Yeah, and that's another good one.
Oh, hold on one second. I want to address what Emily just said. Sometimes you might want to redact certain things because you're going to post it publicly, and that is totally fine. But try to be very specific about what you redact, because sometimes the most subtle thing, and I've had this happen to me where somebody did post an entire screenshot, and because I had parts of the URL, even though they redacted it, it was enough to help me get further in solving that person's problem. So don't like, even if you have to redact carefully, because sometimes those little bits that aren't personal identifiable information can be really useful. Sorry.
Right. Or gee, it only happens when the title has a single quote in it, but you can't see that because it's all redacted.
Yeah, so I'm going to come back to Emily's screenshot thing, but I had a customer issue just a couple of weeks ago. Mark, you're familiar with this customer. They have an add-in that lets them open up SharePoint folders in Explorer, and I got an email from them. This thing doesn't work anymore. And so, of course, I jumped into their tenant, and it worked. And so what we found out was it doesn't work on folders with an ampersand in the name or a plus sign, something like that. But, they didn't give me good, and they hadn't tried much. They just shot it to me. But yeah, that's, how do I reproduce it? That plus sign was the thing. Back to Emily's thing. I send screenshots with everything. I'm a huge fan of Snagit by TechSmith. Everybody that doesn't have it, go out and buy it right now. But anytime I'm explaining anything to a customer or whatever, and they tell me a thing like this customer here, they said this doesn't work. I reproduced it. It worked. I sent them screenshots of what I did, even though I wasn't seeing the problem. I do screenshots for every single thing that I ever do, because one of the problems we have, and we'll talk about this later, is we assume that everybody knows what we know. We assume that our experience is universal as everybody's experience, but that's just not the case. So screenshots take a lot of ambiguity out of that. So I'm a big fan of those.
And Todd, you can, the later versions of Snagit, you can create GIFs. So you can actually show, I go here, I do this, and this happens.
Yeah,
you don't have to do it with stills anymore, which is fantastic.
Yep.
We'll do a separate Ask and Praxis on GIF versus GIF, I think. I'm got a half hour on that easy.
Yeah, OneNote, Iris mentioned that, same deal. OneNote's great because it will also, and I guess Snagit will too, OneNote will OCR your screenshots. So if you paste a screenshot into OneNote, it will read the text, so you can go back later and search for that text. And Snagit has, when you get an image in there, you can right click on it. So it's good for copying out error messages. Another thing, if you get an error message in Windows, if you highlight the dialog box and hit Control-C, it will copy the text out also. So that can be handy when you're doing the Googling that Mike suggested.
Good point by Mark on some of the operational security things. Don't just throw a shape over the object and then not flatten it. You're not really securing anything. You're obscuring it for like a moment. Fair point on that as well.
Yeah, it depends on the file type though, because like if in Snagit you put the little shady box over it and then you copy that image, it's a flat image by default. So.
Oh, is it? I always flatten all anyway in the editor.
Not.
You're working too hard.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Fair enough.
You're not working smart, Mike.
Well, that's
if
not
you
the first
save
time.
it as the snag file format, you're
then
not
it's got
working
layers.
too hard.
Then you got layers.
Then it's got layers. But if you're saving it as like a PNG or a GIF
Oh,
or a
no.
JPEG.
Okay, I feel a holy war coming.
Oh, let's just accept you are wrong, and then move on.
Everybody who thinks Mike is wrong, raise your hand. All
I
opposed.
think you just need to go Google it, and you'll see the answer yourselves. It's not that hard. We are indeed geeks, Steve. Thank you. All right, let's carry on. Let's advance the ball here. Okay, cool. Very good. So, Mark, I think you surfaced a lot of these, and I think you're active as both a giver and a getter on a lot of these. Do you want to lead us on this one?
I'm mostly a taker, but yes. So knowing where to ask for support about a specific thing is almost as important as asking it well, right? So for example, if I'm having a problem with Power Automate and I go ask in the SharePoint group, maybe that might work, but there's probably a better place to do it. So part of being a good community member is to know where you should go and try to get support. There are some general places that you can go, things like Stack Overflow or GitHub, like the P&P area of GitHub. And Julie and Emily and I are all of us are sort of like, yeah, but don't ask a lot of questions there. Again, if they're well-formed questions and they have to do with the place where you're asking them, that's awesome. But don't just lob random questions into a random place. I'm an admin for a couple of groups on Facebook, And it's amazing the kinds of things that people lob in there thinking that they're appropriate questions for that. Like there's a SharePoint group. Well, asking a question about operational readiness is not necessarily a really good idea. You might get some opinions, but make sure that you're finding the right forum, or at least a forum that seems to mention the stuff that you're looking for, if you can. If you don't know, one of the places that you can go is the tech community that Microsoft runs. And they have a bunch of different, I forget what they call them. They call them areas or topics or
Communities.
Communities, one of those words. And you can try to guess which community in the tech community might be the best one, and you'll probably guess reasonably well. But you'll find that the more that you use support, the more you'll learn which support channels are best for the kinds of questions that you're asking. Twitter can be great for short stuff, but it's really not great for long stuff. So make sure that your sort of width and breadth is right for the medium that you're choosing as well. So lots of variables in that, but getting to know the landscape, asking other people in the community just, hey, where should I ask this question is a totally reasonable thing to do, and you're likely to get a lot more focused response.
And shout out to Emily and Mike Dixon and Julie and Derek and others who have led user groups on there, because not to underestimate the ability to just show up and ask people who share this interest and share this capability to the odd question of like, hey, I encountered this. Are you seeing it in your tenant, et cetera? So user groups are also obviously a great place. I think the Todd number is a 1-900 number. Mark, just FYI.
Yeah, Mike, you have to have your credit card ready when you call.
Anything else on support resources that we see? Emily, you just plowed a bunch of them into the chat as well.
She is on it. Holy cow. I don't even think URL before she's got it in there.
Question from Nutter.
Mark mentioned the putting in a service request in the admin center. So there you're asking Microsoft for help. Not my favorite thing to do, but sometimes you need to lodge that with Microsoft so that you know that there's that anchor in their giant support machine in case you need to give that support number to one of your partners or something. So I think you should try to use that relatively sparingly for something that you really think is a platform problem, as opposed to something that you just don't understand.
Somebody just said, Steve Pope just said, support for Microsoft has gotten better. I'm like, not my experience, but okay.
we all want
we
want to be able to say that. I mean, usually, I think, Julie, when you and I get, or anybody at some praxis gets in touch with Microsoft, it's usually something that we know it's a real problem, and we know what the problem is, and we know how to fix it. And even then, it's really hard to get to
I don't know. When you get support on the line, they're like, I actually have no idea anything about the SharePoint platform. So can you explain what SharePoint is before I try to help you solve this very technical SharePoint problem? That's always a fun time.
Did you try reformatting your hard drive?
Rebooting SharePoint.
Sorry, would you mind just putting your replacement on the line? I don't want to have to repeat this.
I actually just said, just move me to senior support, because I don't have time.
Well, we generally are asking 300 and 400 level support questions.
We are. Right? Yeah. It's a valid point.
But there is a question in the chat and I'm sorry if I'm getting your name wrong, Nadir, about places where we can recommend for support with SPFX specific questions.
SP Dev Docs.
SP Dev Docs.
Yeah.
We'll throw a link in the chat.
Emily,
when you're...
link. No, I'll get it.
Yeah.
So I want to actually give a huge shout out to SharePoint Engineering on this subject, because they have absolutely upped their game about answering the issues in the SP Dev Docs repo. So absolutely, if you have a SharePoint Frameworks issue or related issue and you post it in SP Dev Docs, I'm seeing just great responses coming in there, really timely, and things are actually starting to get addressed. And we're seeing especially with SharePoint framework notes. If anyone has not seen and is interested, the 1.14 release notes that just came out with all the documentation, just so much better, so much improved. So it's really impressive. So there's an area of Microsoft support that I do agree Steve Pope has improved exponentially. So that's definitely the way to get that.
I think
Nader,
if you had a question about SharePoint framework, like I don't know how to do something, or I tried this and it's not working, going straight to the dev docs might be okay. But I mean, that's more about there's this thing that's not working well. Don't expect an answer for, geez, I can't figure out where the semicolon goes, because that's just not what that's for. I think that those 2 Facebook groups that are at the top of the list that Emily just put out, we get a lot of SharePoint framework questions in there. And the answers are, sometimes very good and sometimes not so great, but at least you get a lot of attention. So that's another thing to think about is, how quickly do you need the answer? And when you post, don't say this is the most important thing and all of you have to answer me right now. But, think about the sort of cycle time that you see in each one of these support channels. Sorry, Derek, go ahead.
I was going to sort of echo some of what you were saying. I think it really depends on what it is that you're asking for, because the dev docs are great if there's an issue or you need support on SPFX. But if you want to know how to build a web part or how to build a new extension, an ACE or something like that, there's a lot of good documentation in the developer documents. So you can also get a lot of really good tutorials and good content there as well.
I might then actually take it one step further and say there's been so many demos on the PNP SharePoint framework community calls that and they post those as individual, each demo is an individual video. What was the stat? YouTube is the second biggest search engine after Google or whatever. So, Google or YouTube searching the Microsoft PNP community channel can also yield you some great information. So that's another good one.
I know it's been a while, but there's also in-person events are a fantastic time to get your questions answered. So whether you are going to ask people that are presenting or maybe some of your other community members there, and I'll just paste in, there are quite a few upcoming.
All right. So we talked about before you go and we talked about where to go. Let's talk about when you get there. When engaging support, what are some of the things we have found as Simpraxians that work well for us? We get more flies with honey than with vinegar, right?
Yeah. So I brought up one of these at the beginning. Being somebody who helps run a public community library in the shape of, for me, PNP.js. Sometimes, and it's rare, but sometimes you'll get somebody who's just really disrespectful in their request for help. And, we sort of said it at the beginning, but given the fact that these things are run by people who volunteer their time to do these things, to sort of start out saying, your library sucks and this is terrible and blah, 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 and this doesn't work and you better fix it immediately, kind of doesn't set a tone where somebody's going to want to actually help you at all. So, you might have actually shot yourself in the foot just because you couldn't put on a pleasant tone, to your request. So that's a big one there.
Yeah,
about
Julie, I
echo
think it's
that.
important. Go ahead, Todd.
I will echo that. One thing that really turns me off is when people are frustrated and they post stuff and their frustration is the biggest part of their post. Or another one is if people are like, I'm just going to vent here. No, don't vent here. That's what your friends are for. That's what your rubber duck's for. If I go to a support place and I see somebody just venting and spewing anger, I will pretty much ignore them from there on out. So yeah, if you're frustrated, go take a walk around the block and then, yeah, I agree.
Some of this stuff is really hard, right? I mean, so being frustrated is part of that process, but you need to not let that go into the support channel. You're looking for help and you're asking for assistance, hopefully politely.
So one thing I just wanted to point out is that if folks don't already know this, if you're looking or posting in almost any of the PNP related repos, most of those are done on a volunteer basis. There are some staff, Microsoft staff people that are part of that, but, learning pathways, I don't know about DevDocs, Julie, but, I know
Yeah,
the
I
ACES
think
repo, the
learning
samples
pathways is
repos.
the only exception to what you're trying to say. Learning pathways is the
Oh.
only exception where there are some Microsoft people specifically tasked with working on that repo. Otherwise, even when those people are Microsoft people, specifically,
They're doing
I'll
it
say with
on their free
PMPJS, they do it on their free time. That is not
Yeah.
part of their working hours. So even if you see a Microsoft person interacting with people in the PMP repos, that is still a volunteer situation. And
Yeah.
those people need to be treated with respect because it's a lot of extra time that they're putting in just because they love the community.
Yeah. So I guess to that respect point, just be aware, because a lot of folks don't even understand that. I know I was working on learning pathways, and I had somebody like pepper me over and over again. When is this going to get into the backlog of enhancements? And quite honestly, I had to explain to them that this isn't my day job. So go ahead,
And
Emily. Sorry.
Oh yeah, no problem. After getting that support, it's also incredibly important to follow up. Sometimes the item is offered for the solution, and then it just goes silent, and we have no idea if that worked or not. We don't know if we can close the issue. We don't know if you still need help. And then it's really helpful to find out, yes, that is the thing that solved my issue, because then it's also an answer for other people who are coming to this forum.
That's the
Yeah.
key. That's the key right
Yeah,
there.
I see that happen a lot in the Facebook groups where somebody says, "Did you figure this out?" And the person who had the original problem says, "I solved it."
Yeah. I've seen that too.
Yeah, okay.
Hey,
Maybe you could
that's-
help everyone else out. Explain a little bit. Give us the 2-sentence version. I realized I didn't have the semicolon, or I removed the web part and it stopped doing the thing I was worried about. Because then you have all these dangling conversations that really just get in the way of people solving problems.
It's a great point.
And to go on that, like folks have said, most of these people do this voluntarily. It's not their job. And so a lot of them do it for that feeling of solving the problem. And so coming back and saying, hey, that was the right fix, Mark, thanks, encourages Mark to provide more fixes.
People actually say thank you to you?
To me all the time. Oh, I get people send me flowers. They don't do that to you?
Little pat
yeah,
on the head. Little
Gifts.
pat on the head occasionally.
I'm not complaining at all. I mean, but it's infrequent enough that when somebody does it, it makes a big difference. And
I agree.
You're more likely to respond to that person the next time.
Yeah.
All right, we're getting close on time, folks.
Krista had a question about user voice, though.
Yep.
Did there is not, Krista, a full replacement for user voice. It's sort of on a, and I hate to say this because it's just so terrible, but it's on a product group by product group basis, and as to what they have replaced user voice with for themselves at this point. For SharePoint framework, I can only speak to that one. Enhancement requests to that go in that SP DevDocs issues list. There's a link there for enhancement requests that takes you to a separate website. So that's the place to start to do that. Any of the other ones, I don't have specific answers.
There is, sorry, I put the wrong link in the chat. I'm going to put in the right link, but there is a feedback portal now, and many of the groups are migrating over there. They shut down user voice for some reason. We don't really know why, and a lot of the groups are going into that feedback hub.
Anything else on the resources that we've kind of enumerated here? Also new in the resources slide, upcoming events. So as in-person events start to come back into being, we'll incorporate these here. We're to see and meet and interact with real live Sympraxians in the wild, and
their natural habitat.
And in 2 weeks' time, we're going to take our own advice. We're going to be really careful to be respectful and professional and not ranty, but about who really suffers when there is no API.
Yeah,
so
another topic.
We got the rants out of our system already. We'll present it nicely. Anything else?
I think we have anything else.
All right.
Did it all.
Thanks, everybody.
Top of the hour. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. We'll talk to you in 2 weeks.
Thanks.
Bye.